Shalom, I'm Dr. Dina Dye with Foundations in Torah, and welcome to this series of programs called In the Beginning, a phrase I'm sure you're very familiar with. The reality, though, is if we're going to understand the end, we got to go back to the beginning. I know many of you know the very first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. The question is, what does that really mean? Now, we're going to find, if we go back to the ancient world, that their whole world was built around the concept of temples. And we'll find that Genesis chapter 1 has much to do with temple language and temple imagery. So the concept of creation and temple, if you will, are synonymous terms. I know it's hard for us to think of it in that way, but this is the structure and framework of the Bible. The Bible is first and foremost an ancient Near East language and culture and context. We're not used to looking at the Bible in that way, but I hope through this series that this will begin to make sense to you. I know we don't recognize temple language. It's not something we're familiar with. We don't really study it. And actually, if we go into the New Testament, we find, particularly in the book of John, we know that Yeshua, Jesus, makes his way up to the temple numerous times. And in fact, he's going up for the various festivals and celebrations. And a lot of temple language is tucked in to those different dialogues, particularly John 7 through 9, for example, when Yeshua goes up to the temple for the Festival of Tabernacles or the Feast of Sukkot. And there's a lot of temple language in there associated with the feasts. So my hope through this series is to help you understand and see the temple language flowing through the scriptures. Now, we know that Yeshua taught using temple language. Now, you may not have thought of it in that way, but for example, the parables. I know you're familiar with all his parables. That's all kingdom language. And the Proverbs, that in fact is also kingdom language pointing to a temple or a house. And the kingdom concept is something that is synonymous with the temple as well. So for instance, in the ancient world, when a deity over a particular city would have his king build a temple, once that temple was finished, the deity would enter inside and he would go into the inner chamber with his consort, and they would essentially make baby gods. So the inner sanctum, which we would call the Holy of Holies in our temple, has something to do with bringing forth new life. And this was very common in the ancient Near East world. Now we're going to see that the idea of the temple through scripture is its own language. It has symbols and idioms and imagery. In fact, one of the most important is what we would call apocalyptic literature. I know you're familiar with that from the book of Revelation. Ezekiel, Daniel has this type of apocalyptic language. But did you know that the apocalyptic language has everything to do with the temple? And again, as we go through this series, that will make sense to you. The temple, the ancient Near East language, the concept of parable and proverb has everything to do with the restoration of the king to his position and the kingdom itself. And the whole concept of new birth and new life comes into this as well. So we are going to look at creation, the temple, its restoration. In fact, we could argue that the entirety of the Bible is restoring creation as it was in the beginning, or rebuilding or building a house. So keep that in mind. Now again, in the beginning, I know we look at it as a chronology, but in fact, the word Bereshit does not mean a sense of time. In fact, in the beginning is not about chronology, it is all about building a house. And that is a completely different way of looking at Genesis chapter 1. But really, it is about house building, in particular, temple building. The idea of in the beginning sets forth a pattern throughout the scriptures for kingdom principles and for kingdom building. And really, kingdom building is all about building a house, because that's where the seed comes forth, the new life comes forth. Again, going back to that place of the inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, and that was where new life would come forth. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Hebrew, the very first word is Bereshit. And it is a fascinating word, which we're going to look at in just a second. But for now, let's just look at a couple of things that in the beginning has. Remember, it's not a chronology. It is a statement about building a house. So it is the creation of a house. It is the concept of filling the house. It is the idea of making a covenant. So, as in a marriage covenant, where the two are in agreement and the covenant brings them together, and there are certain requirements of that covenant. And when one steps out of the covenant, the whole covenant agreement breaks down. This is the same idea of in the beginning, building and making a covenant. In the beginning has to do with bearing seed. When we read all the genealogies in Scripture, this is telling us, this is kingdom language. It's covenant language. It's creation language. I know sometimes when we read those genealogies, our eyes roll back in our head as we try to pronounce all the names. And lots of times we'll just skip over it. But if you could look at it as recreation language, where seed is bearing life, and in particular, the lines of the kings from Adam all the way to the second Adam, it'll help you as you read through those. Again, the idea of Bereshit in the beginning has to do with building a dynasty. So in the beginning, as established, creation building, temple building, and it will take us into chapters 2 and 3 to the garden, which is essentially a temple construct. But there, Adam, is really the first king, if you will, in the precincts of the temple. And we'll be talking about that more as we go into this program. But again, the temple, the creation, which is all of the cosmos, has to do with preserving and protecting the seed. That is basically the heart of God, is to preserve that seed and protect it. And certainly he did that through the lines of the kings. Now, I'd like to take a moment and break down the word Bereshit for you. Now, for those of you not familiar with Hebrew, I've put the transliteration up here to help you read the words. But you have to understand that that first word, Bereshit, contains within it the entirety of creation. And you'll see that as I talk about this. Again, it's not a chronology, it's house building. So our first example here, that you can see up on our monitor, is the word Beit. Now, many of you know Beit is a house. And actually, if you take the word Bereshit, and hopefully you can hear it, the very first letter of Bereshit is a Bet, and the very last letter is the letter Tav. And when you put them together, it forms the word Bet, which is a house. So even within the first and last letters of Bereshit, we have the concept of a house, because the house is first and foremost. And folks, it's not any different in our own reality. You know that your house, the husband and the wife and the children, is the most important thing in your life. And it is essentially the most important thing to God. And that's why he created it in the first place. So another word that we have in Bereshit is the word Brit. Some of you know that means a covenant. Now, it is a covenant established between two people, but the root meaning of the word Brit is actually to cut. So the idea of a covenant is something that is being cut or separated, and that's going to make a little more sense as we get into this. And interesting, if we take the Beit and the Tav, remember the Bet is the first letter of Bereshit, the Tav is the last letter, and we insert the letter Resh, we end up with Brit. And the letter Resh usually means something that's ahead or the beginning. So in the beginning of everything, which again is not a chronology, we have the idea of covenant making, because God, in a sense, made a covenant with the heavens and the earth. He made a covenant, a household covenant with the entirety of the cosmos. The cosmos, or ordered universe, is the place of his presence. Why did he build a house? He built a house because he wanted a place for his presence to dwell. And that is the story of the Bible from beginning to end. The place of God's presence, that's the place where we approach and come into his presence. And he's always had a place for his presence in the world in which we live. Now, we can look at another expression that comes into play in Bereshit, and that is Brit Esh. So you see the word Brit, and now we're adding another word Esh. And if we unscramble those letters, it will form Bereshit again. So again, within Bereshit is giving us the entire plan of God. So Brit Esh is actually a covenant of fire. And I would maintain that the very first covenant that God made with the heavens and the earth was a covenant of fire. And we'll be talking about that as well. Again, in this particular program, we are just introducing concepts that I will be going into in more detail as we get into the different programs. So don't get frustrated. I will be going back and we'll be talking about this in more detail. So another expression that we have in Bereshit is Bat Reshit. So you can hear those letters being repeated, can't you? So Bat in Hebrew has the very same letters as Bet. A Beit and a Tav forms a house, but a Beit and a Tav also makes the word daughter, Bat. You might be familiar with the daughter, Bat. And let me just make a statement here, because this is very important. In the ancient understanding, it was sons who would build the house through seed. So as a house expanded, the sons were the ones responsible for building the house, but the actual house was called a daughter. And that'll come to play as we go through Isaiah and some of the other prophets. So they talk about, O virgin daughter of Zion or Zion. And that's because it's referring to the temple. And let me also mention that the temple, creation, and Jerusalem are all essentially synonymous terms. So when we're talking about Jerusalem, we're actually talking about the temple, and that's very important. So Bat Reshi is like the first daughter, or my daughter is first. That's because the house is the very first thing, if you will. The house, again, similar to Jerusalem. Now we can look at another example of a word found in Bereshit, and that is Beit Reshi, which is my house is the head, or the head is the house. And this is speaking of a very important concept, the concept of unity, because unity can only be found in a house. And so we're going to explore this idea of unity and what it means to be one. Because after all, did not God say, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one? And what does that even mean? I think most of us would have an opinion about what it means, but do we understand what it means in the context of the house? And again, we'll be investigating this in a lot more detail as we go through. So we had Bat Reshi. Now we can add another word. Do you see how many words there are? In fact, I one time sat down and went through Bereshit trying to find as many Hebrew words as I could. And I came to about 75, and I don't think I was done. So these expressions all come through this concept of in the beginning, which again is house building. So we have Beit Ashrei. Now that means the house of honor. Now you might be familiar with Ashrei, although you don't know it. This is our Hebrew term, but in English, it gets translated the Beatitudes. So when Yeshua went through the 8 different Beatitudes, he was basically giving us kingdom language, because those things that he expresses do not function in the physical world. These are manifestations of the world outside of time, or the kingdom. And so this idea of in the house was a supernatural place, if you will, the temple construct where God is seated on his throne, where his presence dwells, is a supernatural environment where things happen there that don't normally happen. And so the house was a special place, and the house was the place of honor. In all of the cosmos, the place of God's presence was the place of honor. And of course, many of you know that the ancient world was one described in terms of honor and shame. That was the nature of its culture. And so this idea of honor and the house are connected. And another one would be Bar Reshit. Now that's interesting, because bar gets translated grain. So now we have the first grain, which is what Israel was called. She was called the first grain. You can actually read about that in Jeremiah, that she is the first grain. So it's very interesting, all these expressions that come out of the very first word of the Bible. And lastly, we have another expression, Bara Sheteh. Now that's an interesting one, because we could translate that as he made them two. Now you can see the picture of a marriage, because the marriage is the manifestation of what a house is supposed to look like, where a husband and wife come together and produce seed. in the same way that I talked about when the god, the deity over the city in the ancient world, say in ancient Mesopotamia, would take his consort into the inner sanctum and bring forth new life. So the house is the place where new life comes forth. And I can't stress that enough. It's absolutely essential and foundational, because God is all about life. That is the key, bar none. His heart is about life. And so as we go through the descriptions of the various families in the Bible, we find that they're all essentially recreation stories. So there we have the creation and we have the fall, and the concept of recreation has everything to do with a family, with a husband and wife, with seed coming forth, and through, again, as I mentioned, the genealogies. So let's look back for a moment at the very first expression or verse in the Bible, as I've been talking about. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashemayim ve'et haaretz would be the Hebrew. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Or in the beginning, Bereshit, God cut a covenant, if you will, with the heavens and the earth. And so the earth would be the place of his dwelling. So when it talks about cutting a covenant, what it means is that two things are separated so that they will come back together and join together, and that the two will become one. That is the nature of Genesis chapter 1. Now, I'd just like to mention two books by one of my favorite professors, Dr. John Walton from Wheaton College. And these books are not serious academic tomes. I mean, the work is serious, but you can read them. They're very easy to read. One of them is called The Lost World of Adam and Eve, and the other one's called The Lost World of Genesis 1. And he lays out an excellent case for some of these concepts that I'm sharing. So I would really encourage you in that regard. I think his scholarship is excellent, and he thinks outside the box, and I think sometimes that's really what we need. So the idea of what he is saying in his books, which I would agree with wholeheartedly, is that the Bible does not teach science or actually reveal science. The reality is that in the 21st century, we are the products of the age of reason and enlightenment, and we think in scientific terms. But you have to understand that the ancient cultures did not think that way. They thought in terms of symbols and imagery and metaphors. Theirs was a world that we would describe as being myth. Now, the problem with that word is I can hardly use it without all of us going to the one place that myth has become. That means it's a fiction, it's not true, it's just for primitive tribes and peoples. But myth in the ancient world had a very different meaning. In fact, myth had everything to do with describing the world in which they lived in particular, the world that functioned outside of time. So Dr. Walton's premise is that the Bible isn't so much teaching about science, but and it doesn't really reveal how the world works per se in scientific terms, but it certainly does reveal how God himself works in our world. It's just, how do we get back to reading the Bible in the way that it was written by the people that wrote it? So these authors that wrote the Bible had an ancient Near East mindset, and that is how they wrote. We approach the Bible with our 21st century mindset, and in many occasions we end up making the wrong connections or misapplying what's being said. Now, I'm not talking about we can't make an application. Certainly we make the application with the principles that God has given us and laid out. But the fact of the matter is the Bible was written to an ancient Near East culture, but it certainly is for us today, and it certainly helps us and ministers to us. So that's not what I'm saying. But I am just really trying to get you to grasp the idea that it is a book that has ancient Near East culture, context, language, and the concepts that are related to it. So yes, God does reveal himself, but the book is not first and foremost a scientific book. Certainly, it describes the everyday life in the ancient world, and that's something we're very detached from. We don't really understand life in the ancient Near East world. It's not written in a language that we're familiar with. It's not common to us. It's not a culture that we have very much understanding about, except for scholars who spend a great deal of time trying to unlock the ancient cultures, but we tend not to approach the scriptures in that way. So it doesn't really answer the questions about our modern world, although again we can make application, but it does not specifically focus on our modern world. It doesn't really explain, the Bible that is, how our modern world works or operates. So if we approach it in that way, we're probably going to misapply some things. So, and as I mentioned several times now, that the Bereshit, the Genesis, is not really about a chronology, so we have to be careful that it's not about putting it on a timeline and going, this happened first, then this, then this. That's not how the ancients thought. They didn't work things on a timeline. One of the most important aspects of the ancient Near East peoples is that they were people, they learned by hearing. They were hearers of what was being said. So we have these storytellers telling us these stories of creation and things like that. And so the ancients would hear these things, and then they would fill in the blanks. Think of it kind of like some of the stories we have in the Bible, or some of the parables. If the people were listening to Yeshua explain a parable or tell a parable, they would hear the story and they would fill in from their mind things that they knew in the world around them. We in the 21st century, however, have become what we would call visual learners. We are totally focused in on visual learning. We have to be visually stimulated 24/7. In fact, it's really hard for us to learn any other way. But you think back before the time of television, when the family would sit around around the radio and they would listen. And so they could create images and things in their mind as they listened to the radio. This is not a world that we're familiar with anymore. And so it makes it difficult. So the ancient world were hearers of the word, and more than what we are today. Again, we tend to be visual learners, and that is a whole different way of receiving. And the Bible was actually, the stories were written for those who would hear, and they would kind of be able to fill in their own visual, if you will. Now, I thought Dr. Walton made a very important statement to me anyways, because he was trying to explain the difference between the ancient Near East world and our modern world. And I thought his comparison was very appropriate, and so I wanted to bring this out. So for instance, if we're talking about the heavens, and we know there's stars and constellations and the moon and the sun and all these things in the sky. So we would have, for instance, the Hubble telescope would show us these things, but the Hubble telescope would look at it in a way that's scientific. Where are they located? What substance are they made of? How do they work, etc. On the other hand, if you take somebody like the famous artist Vincent van Gogh, which is actually Vincent van Gogh is the proper pronunciation. If we look at his work, Starry Night, so he's taking the same things, the sun, the stars, the moon, etc., and he's creating a visual impression of what that looks like. Now, both are true. What the Hubble telescope is seeing is true, and what Vincent van Gogh was seeing is also true. So think of the ancient Near East world as being described in the way that an artist does, that he sees visions, he sees it as a visual in a way, and he's not looking for what the substances, what the moon and the stars are made out of or how they work. He's trying to project an image and a symbol of what it represents in his heart, for example. And key to understanding the ancient Near East world is also understanding that theirs was a world of function and purpose, and not so much a world of what it was made of, its composition, how does it systematically work in a construct. No, it's not geared or built around those things. So I thought that was a really good analysis of the difference between the two. So I hope that sort of explains and makes more sense to you if we can look at it, because the Bible, again, is really not, it's not written in terms of science. The Bible is basically a book that appeals to the senses, in particular hearing. And so that is the world of the ancient Near East. Let me just close out this session with a quote that I have found to be very helpful to me from a scholar named Margaret Barker. She said, "The temple is like an ancient tapestry. In some parts, the picture has faded. In others, the threads are no longer clear. It is impossible to understand the temple using 20th century post-Enlightenment ways." Now, I find that to be very profound, because that is typically how we approach everything. We're going to approach it from our 20th century modern mind, but the temple is not part of our world. Now, the Asians and the Japanese, etc., Chinese, they understand more of what a temple is. But in terms of today's culture, we don't really understand it all that well. And so Margaret is communicating to us here that the picture has faded from how the ancients wrote it, going back to 2,000 years before BCE, before Yeshua even came on the scene. And we cannot approach the temple and the concept of the cosmos and the recreation from using 20th century ways. It's just simply, it doesn't work for us. So I want to encourage you, I'm going to close out this session, to just take a deep breath, and we're trying to approach the scriptures in the way they were written. And again, it has nothing to do with making it personal application in our life, because we must do that. And we take those words, and those words can be profound in our own lives, and they can transform us, and they can heal us, and they can change us. And that's not what I'm saying, but I am trying to look at the Bible from the beginning, in the beginning, as it would have been looked at by the ancient world. And so I think as we go through this, it's going to make a lot more sense to you. And I look forward to talking more in more detail about the construct of the temple. So see you next time. Shalom.